Have you ever wondered what happens when love blooms in the most dangerous circumstances imaginable? When choosing to protect someone could cost you everything you hold dear? When a single moment of compassion becomes an act of rebellion that could end your life? Tonight, I'm going to share with you one of the most extraordinary and forbidden love stories from World War II. A tale that will challenge everything you think you know about courage, sacrifice, and the choices we make when survival itself hangs in the balance. Picture this. It's November 1944, and Budapest stands as one of the last bastions of Nazi control in Eastern Europe. The Soviet army is closing in from the east, while the city's streets echo with the sound of jackboots and the whispered fears of those who dare not speak too loudly. In this world of shadows and secrets, where trust could mean the difference between life and death, something impossible was about to unfold. This is the story of Alina Kovacs and Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, two people who should have been enemies, who should have never met, who should have walked past each other without a second glance. Instead, they found something so powerful, so dangerous, that it would change both their lives forever. But before we dive into their extraordinary tale, let me tell you why this story matters more than you might think. This isn't just another war romance. This isn't just a story of star-crossed lovers caught in the machinery of conflict. This is a testament to the fact that even in humanity's darkest hours, when evil seems to triumph and hope appears lost, the human heart finds ways to rebel against hatred. Their story reveals how love can become the most dangerous act of defiance imaginable, how two souls can recognize each other across the artificial boundaries that war creates, how compassion can flourish even when the entire world has seemingly lost its mind. I spent months researching this account, piecing together fragments from personal letters, diary entries, and testimonies that survived the siege of Budapest. What I discovered was a love story so incredible, so heart-wrenching, and so impossible that it reads like fiction. But every detail is real. Every stolen moment, every whispered conversation, every heart-stopping close call actually happened. The documents I uncovered paint a picture of two people who found each other against impossible odds, who discovered that love could exist even in a world designed to destroy it. Their correspondence, hidden for decades in a bombed-out basement, reveals the true cost of choosing humanity over hatred during one of history's most brutal chapters. Alina Kovacs was 25 years old in the autumn of 1944, a jazz singer performing in the smoky underground clubs of Budapest. She had a voice that could make grown men weep, a presence that commanded attention the moment she stepped onto any stage. Before the war, she had dreamed of performing in Paris or New York, of seeing her name in lights and her record spinning in dance halls across the world. But those dreams had been buried under the weight of occupation and survival. Now, she sang for German officers and Hungarian collaborators, her voice a soundtrack to their celebrations, while her heart broke a little more each night. She had learned to smile when cameras flashed, to laugh at jokes that weren't funny, to pretend that entertaining the enemy was just another performance rather than a daily betrayal of everything she believed. The Blue Moon was one of Budapest's most exclusive nightclubs, a place where the city's elite gathered to forget about the war raging beyond its walls. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across tables laden with champagne and caviar that most citizens hadn't seen in years. Hungarian aristocrats mingled with German high command, their laughter rising above the sound of Alina's voice as she performed the American standards that had somehow survived the cultural purges. Friedrich Weber was 31, a Wehrmacht officer who carried himself with the bearing of someone who had seen too much and questioned everything. He had arrived in Budapest 3 weeks earlier, assigned to oversee the city's defenses as Soviet forces pushed closer to the Hungarian capital. Unlike many of his colleagues, Friedrich took no pleasure in the privileges that came with his rank. The fine wines and elaborate dinners felt like mockery when he knew what was happening in the streets beyond the officers' quarters. He had grown up in a small Bavarian village where his father taught literature at the local gymnasium. Before conscription changed the course of his life, Friedrich had planned to follow in his father's footsteps, to spend his days discussing poetry and philosophy with eager students rather than coordinating military strategies that would determine who lived and who died. The uniform he wore represented everything Alina had been taught to fear and despise. Yet beneath that gray wool and polished insignia was a young man struggling with conscience, questioning orders that felt wrong, wondering how the world had become so twisted that protecting one's homeland required destroying someone else's. Their first meeting was not romantic. It was not planned. It was a moment of pure chance that could have ended in tragedy for both of them. Alina was performing her final set of the evening, her voice wrapping around the melancholy notes of a Hungarian folk song she had adapted into English. The Blue Moon was packed with its usual crowd of officers and officials, their faces flushed with alcohol and the false confidence that came from believing themselves untouchable. Friedrich sat alone at a corner table, nursing a glass of wine that had grown warm in his hands. He had come to the club not for entertainment, but because his commanding officer had insisted that maintaining good relations with the local elite was essential for military effectiveness. He watched Alina perform with the detached interest of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than seeking pleasure, but something in her voice caught his attention in a way that surprised him. There was pain hidden beneath the polished performance, a depth of feeling that spoke to something he recognized in himself. As she sang, her eyes swept across the crowded room, acknowledging applause and returning smiles with practiced ease. When her gaze met his, however, something unexpected passed between them. It lasted only a moment, that first connection across the smoky darkness of the nightclub. Alina saw not just another German officer, but someone whose eyes held the same weariness she felt in her own heart. Friedrich saw not just another entertainer catering to the occupation forces, but a woman whose spirit had not been broken despite everything she had endured. Neither spoke that night. Neither approached the other or made any gesture that might have been noticed by the watching crowd. But both felt something shift in their understanding of the world around them. Alina finished her set and retreated to her dressing room, while Friedrich paid his bill and walked back to his quarters through streets that felt somehow different than they had an hour before. The second time they saw each other was 3 days later, and this meeting would set in motion events that neither could have predicted or controlled. Alina was walking home from an afternoon rehearsal when she witnessed something that stopped her cold. A group of Arrow Cross militiamen had cornered an elderly Jewish man in an alley just off Vasai Street, their voices harsh with the particular cruelty that comes from having power over the powerless. The old man clutched a small suitcase to his chest, his eyes wide with terror as the militiamen debated what to do with him. Alina knew she should keep walking. She knew that stopping would only invite attention she couldn't afford. She knew that survival in occupied Budapest meant learning to look away, to pretend not to see the daily horrors that had become routine. But something in the old man's face reminded her of her own grandfather, and she found herself unable to move forward or backward. She stood frozen at the mouth of the alley, watching a scene that played out dozens of times each day across the city. That was when Friedrich appeared, seemingly from nowhere, his officer's uniform commanding immediate attention from the militiamen. He spoke to them in rapid German, his voice carrying an authority that made them step back from their victim. Alina couldn't understand the words, but she could read the body language clearly enough. The militiamen were being dismissed, sent away from their prey by someone whose rank they dared not question. The old man scurried away into the afternoon crowds, clutching his suitcase like a lifeline. The militiamen dispersed with obvious reluctance, denied their entertainment by the intervention of higher authority. And Alina found herself standing face to face with the German officer who had somehow appeared at exactly the right moment to prevent a tragedy. They looked at each other across the narrow alley, both understanding the significance of what had just occurred. Friedrich had used his position to save a life, risking questions about his motives and his loyalty. Alina had witnessed an act of mercy from someone she had been conditioned to see as the enemy. When Friedrich spoke, his voice was quiet and carried only the faintest trace of a German accent. His Hungarian was careful but correct, the words of someone who had taken time to learn the language properly rather than simply barking orders in his native tongue. He asked if she was all right, if the militiamen had threatened her in any way. Alina found herself studying his face as he spoke, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. Instead, she saw genuine concern and something that looked remarkably like shame. She told him she was fine, that she had simply been walking home when she stumbled upon the scene. But even as she spoke the careful, neutral words that survival demanded, she found herself wondering about this man who wore the enemy's uniform, but had acted to prevent rather than cause suffering. Their conversation lasted only a few minutes, conducted in the cautious tones of two people who understood the dangers of being seen together. But in those brief exchanges, something began that would grow into the most important relationship either of them would ever experience. Alina learned that Friedrich was not like the other German officers who frequented the nightclubs and restaurants of occupied Budapest. There was no arrogance in his manner, no assumption of superiority over the people whose country he was helping to control. Instead, she sensed a man who carried his uniform like a burden, rather than a badge of pride. Friedrich discovered that Alina was not simply another performer seeking to curry favor with the occupying forces. Her presence at the scene of potential violence, her obvious distress at what she had witnessed, revealed someone whose humanity had not been compromised by the necessities of survival. When they parted that afternoon, both understood that something significant had occurred. Not love at first sight, but recognition of kindred spirits trapped in circumstances neither had chosen. They walked away in opposite directions, but the memory of their encounter would draw them back together in ways that would prove both wonderful and terrifying. The seeds of their impossible love had been planted in a Budapest alley, witnessed only by the shadows and the lingering echo of an old man's grateful footsteps disappearing into the crowd. The days following their chance encounter in the alley passed with agonizing slowness for both Alina and Friedrich. Each went about their daily routines while carrying the weight of what they had witnessed in each other. Alina performed her nightly sets at the Blue Moon, her voice carrying the same haunting melodies that had made her Budapest's most sought-after entertainer. But now there was something different in her performances, a subtle shift that only the most perceptive listeners might have noticed. Friedrich attended his military briefings and reviewed defensive positions around the city, fulfilling his duties with the same methodical precision that had earned him his rank. Yet his mind wandered more frequently than before, returning again and again to the image of a woman who had stood transfixed by an act of mercy rather than walking away to ensure her own safety. The Blue Moon continued to serve as neutral territory, where the city's elite gathered to maintain the illusion that life could proceed normally despite the war raging beyond Budapest's borders. German officers shared tables with Hungarian aristocrats, their conversations flowing between languages as easily as the expensive wine that filled their glasses. Alina moved through this world like a skilled diplomat, charming her audience while revealing nothing of her true feelings about the men who applauded her performances. It was during one of these evening shows, nearly a week after their encounter in the alley, that Friedrich made a decision that would change everything. He had been attending the Blue Moon regularly since arriving in Budapest, but always as part of official entertaining duties or at the invitation of superior officers. Tonight, however, he came alone, claiming he needed to unwind after a particularly difficult day of coordinating supply lines. Alina spotted him the moment he entered the club, though she gave no outward sign of recognition. She was in the middle of a sultry rendition of a French chanson, her voice weaving through the cigarette smoke that hung like gauze beneath the crystal chandeliers. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and this time neither looked away quickly. There was something different about this meeting, a charge in the air that had been absent from their previous encounters. Alina felt her pulse quicken as she sang, her words taking on new meaning when directed toward the German officer who sat alone at his corner table. Friedrich found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn by the magnetism of her performance in ways that had nothing to do with mere entertainment. When Alina finished her set and the applause died down, she made her way through the crowd as she always did, accepting compliments and graciously deflecting invitations from admirers who hoped to extend the evening beyond the confines of the nightclub. But tonight, she found herself moving almost unconsciously toward the corner where Friedrich waited, as if pulled by some invisible force neither of them fully understood. Their second conversation was longer than their first, conducted in the careful tones of two people testing the boundaries of what might be possible between them. Friedrich complimented her performance with genuine appreciation, rather than the empty flattery she usually received from German officers. Alina found herself responding with more warmth than she had shown to any member of the occupying forces since the war began. They spoke of music and literature, discovering shared interests that bridged the gap between their vastly different worlds. Friedrich revealed his background as the son of a literature professor, his love of poetry and classical composers that had sustained him through the darkest moments of military service. Alina shared her dreams of performing beyond Budapest's borders, of bringing her music to audiences who would hear it without the shadow of war coloring every note. What struck both of them most powerfully was how natural their conversation felt despite the impossibility of their situation. They were enemy and occupied citizen, predator and prey according to the logic of wartime, yet they spoke to each other with the ease of old friends discovering unexpected common ground. The club's other patrons paid them little attention, assuming that Alina was simply doing what entertainers did best, charming another officer who might prove useful for future bookings or protection. The casual assumption that their interaction was purely professional provided perfect camouflage for something far more significant taking root between them. As the evening wore on and the crowd began to thin, Friedrich made a request that surprised them both. He asked if Alina might be willing to perform a private song, something more personal than the crowd-pleasing standards that made up her usual repertoire. The request was dangerous for several reasons, not least because it suggested a level of intimacy that went far beyond the usual relationship between performer and patron. Alina hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. She led Friedrich to a small alcove near the club's piano where they could speak more privately without attracting unwanted attention. There, in the dim light cast by a single candle, she sang a Hungarian lullaby that her grandmother had taught her as a child. Her voice was softer now, more vulnerable, stripped of the polished performance quality that characterized her public appearances. The song spoke of home and longing, of love that endures despite separation and hardship. As Alina sang, Friedrich closed his eyes and allowed the melody to wash over him, feeling something inside his chest that had been frozen for months slowly begin to thaw. When the last notes faded into silence, both sat without speaking, unwilling to break the spell that had settled around them. It was Friedrich who finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper as he thanked her for the gift of that private performance. Alina found herself looking into his eyes and seeing not the enemy she had been taught to fear, but a man whose soul carried the same wounds that marked her own. The recognition was mutual and immediate, an understanding that went deeper than words or rational thought. They began meeting regularly after that night, though always with careful attention to appearances and timing. Friedrich would arrive at the Blue Moon for her late sets, positioning himself where they could exchange glances without drawing attention from other patrons. Alina would acknowledge his presence with subtle nods and smiles, weaving their private communication into her public performances with skill that came from years of reading audiences and adapting to their moods. Their conversations grew longer and more intimate as the weeks passed. They discovered that both had lost family members to the war, though on opposite sides of the conflict. Friedrich's younger brother had been killed during the siege of Stalingrad, while Alina's cousin had died fighting with the Hungarian resistance. The shared grief created a bond between them that transcended national loyalties and military allegiances. Alina began to see past Friedrich's uniform to the man who wore it with obvious discomfort. He spoke of orders that violated his conscience, of witnessing atrocities that kept him awake at night, of the growing certainty that he was serving a cause that had lost all moral foundation. His pain was real and profound, a mirror of her own anguish at being forced to entertain the very people who had destroyed her country's independence. Friedrich saw in Alina not just a beautiful woman with an extraordinary voice, but someone whose strength and dignity had survived circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. She performed for German officers because survival demanded it, but she had never surrendered her essential humanity to the requirements of occupation. Her music became a form of resistance, a way of preserving Hungarian culture and identity even while appearing to collaborate with its destroyers. The danger of their growing attachment was obvious to both of them, yet neither seemed capable of stepping back from the connection they had discovered. Budapest in late 1944 was a city where trust was a luxury few could afford, where the wrong word to the wrong person could result in arrest, torture, or death. Alina and Friedrich were crossing lines that could not be uncrossed, entering territory where discovery would mean destruction for both of them. But something about their bond felt inevitable, as if they had been moving toward each other across the chaos of war without realizing it until the moment they finally met. Alina began to look forward to Friedrich's appearances at the Blue Moon with an intensity that frightened her. Friedrich found himself taking unnecessary risks to extend their conversations, lingering at the club longer than protocol suggested and asking questions that revealed more interest in Alina personally than could be explained by simple appreciation for her performances. The first time Friedrich walked Alina home from the Blue Moon, both understood they were crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. The streets of Budapest after midnight belonged to shadows and secrets. Alina walked beside Friedrich through the maze of cobblestone alleys that connected the fashionable district, where the Blue Moon operated, to the modest neighborhood where she maintained a small apartment. Their footsteps echoed softly against the ancient walls of buildings that had witnessed centuries of Hungarian history, now bearing silent witness to this most unlikely of romances. Friedrich had insisted on escorting her home, citing the dangers that lurked in a city under military occupation. But both knew his real motivation went far deeper than simple concern for her safety. These walks through the darkened streets had become their most precious moments together, the only time they could speak freely without the watchful eyes of club patrons or the possibility of being overheard by those who might report suspicious behavior to the authorities. Alina found herself treasuring these midnight conversations in ways that surprised her with their intensity. Friedrich spoke to her about his childhood in Bavaria, painting word pictures of mountain villages where church bells marked the passing of peaceful days, and his father's students gathered to discuss literature that celebrated human dignity rather than glorifying war. His voice carried a wistfulness that made her heart ache for the man he might have been if history had taken a different course. She told him about her own dreams, the ambitions that had sustained her through years of occupation and hardship. Before the war, she had imagined herself performing in the great concert halls of Europe, her voice carrying Hungarian melodies to audiences who would appreciate their beauty without needing to understand the political circumstances that had shaped them. Now those dreams felt like memories from someone else's life, beautiful but impossibly distant. Their conversations revealed the depth of loneliness that both had been carrying through the war years. Alina had learned to survive by maintaining emotional distance from everyone around her, trusting no one completely because betrayal could come from any direction. Friedrich had isolated himself even from his fellow officers, unable to share their enthusiasm for victories that came at such terrible human cost. Finding each other had begun to heal wounds that neither had fully acknowledged they were carrying. Alina discovered that she could laugh again, that joy was still possible even in the darkest of circumstances. Friedrich felt parts of his humanity awakening that he had thought were permanently damaged by everything he had witnessed and been forced to participate in. The apartment building where Alina lived stood in a district that had once housed Budapest's middle-class professionals. Now many of the flats stood empty, their former occupants having fled the city or simply disappeared into the machinery of war. Alina's third-floor apartment was small but comfortable, furnished with pieces that spoke of better times when such luxuries could be taken for granted. She had never invited Friedrich inside, understanding that crossing that particular threshold would represent a level of intimacy that could no longer be explained away as professional courtesy or casual friendship. But on the night when everything changed between them, circumstances conspired to make that choice for her. They had been walking more slowly than usual, both reluctant to end an evening that had felt particularly magical. Alina had performed with unusual passion that night, her voice carrying emotions that seemed to reach directly into Friedrich's chest and squeeze his heart. He had watched her with undisguised admiration, no longer caring whether other club patrons noticed his obvious fascination with the Hungarian singer. As they approached Alina's building, the sound of aircraft engines rumbled overhead, growing louder with each passing second. The air raid sirens that had become a nightly feature of life in Budapest began their mournful wail, echoing off the surrounding buildings like the voices of mechanical ghosts warning of approaching destruction. Soviet bombers had begun targeting Budapest with increasing frequency as their ground forces pushed closer to the city. These raids served both military and psychological purposes, designed to weaken German defenses while demonstrating to the civilian population that liberation or conquest, depending on one's perspective, was inevitable. Alina grabbed Friedrich's arm instinctively as the first explosions bloomed in the distance, orange flowers of destruction that lit up the night sky with deadly beauty. The building's other residents were already hurrying toward the basement shelter, their movements quick and practiced from months of similar midnight interruptions. Friedrich looked at Alina's face in the flickering light cast by distant fires and saw fear that had nothing to do with the bombs falling on their city. She was terrified of being seen entering the shelter with a German officer, of the questions and suspicions that such an association would inevitably generate among her neighbors. Without hesitation, Friedrich made a decision that would bind their fates together more completely than any words of love could have accomplished. He told Alina to go to her apartment, to stay away from the communal shelter where their presence together would be noticed and remembered. He would remain with her, he said, to ensure her safety during the raid. Alina's apartment became their sanctuary that night as Budapest shuddered under the impact of high-explosive bombs and incendiary devices that turned entire city blocks into infernos. They sat together on her small sofa, listening to the sounds of destruction raining down from the sky, while discovering that physical proximity only intensified the emotional connection that had been growing between them for weeks. Friedrich removed his military jacket for the first time in Alina's presence, an action that felt more intimate than any embrace they might have shared. Without the harsh lines of his uniform, he looked younger, more vulnerable, more like the literature professor he might have become in a different world. Alina found herself studying his face in the candlelight, memorizing features that had become dear to her despite every rational argument against such feelings. They talked through the night as the bombing raid continued around them, their voices barely above whispers as they shared secrets that could have destroyed them both if overheard by the wrong ears. Friedrich told Alina about the orders he had begun to question, the increasing pressure from his superiors to implement policies that violated everything his conscience told him was right. He spoke of his growing certainty that Germany would lose the war, and his terror of what that defeat might mean for someone like him who had worn the Wehrmacht uniform. Alina revealed her own fears about the future, her uncertainty about what liberation might bring to someone who had spent years performing for German officers. She worried that her survival through collaboration, however forced it might have been, would mark her as a traitor to her own people when the war finally ended. The complexity of her situation filled her with anguish that she had never been able to share with anyone until now. As dawn approached and the bombing raid finally ended, both Alina and Friedrich understood that their relationship had entered new territory. They had spent an entire night alone together, sharing intimacies that went far beyond physical attraction. They had seen each other without the masks that public life required, vulnerable and honest in ways that created bonds stronger than steel. When Friedrich finally prepared to leave Alina's apartment, both knew that everything had changed between them. They were no longer simply a German officer and a Hungarian entertainer who had discovered unexpected common ground. They were two people who had found love in the most impossible circumstances imaginable, whose very survival now depended on protecting a secret that could destroy them both. Alina watched from her window as Friedrich made his way through the dawn streets, his uniform restored, but his bearing somehow different than it had been the night before. She pressed her palm against the glass and whispered a prayer to saints she had stopped believing in years ago, asking for protection for the man who had become more important to her than her own safety. Friedrich walked back to his quarters through a city transformed by the night's bombing. Smoke rose from dozens of fires that would burn for days, while rescue workers picked through rubble searching for survivors. The destruction reminded him of cities he had seen on the Eastern Front, places where war had stripped away every pretense of civilization and revealed the raw brutality that humans were capable of inflicting on each other. But even surrounded by evidence of humanity's capacity for destruction, Friedrich carried with him the memory of Alina's voice in the candlelight, the warmth of her presence during those terrifying hours when death had fallen from the sky around them. She had given him something to protect beyond his own survival, a reason to hope that love might prove stronger than the forces trying to tear their world apart. The days following that first night together brought new dangers and new depths to their impossible romance. Alina continued performing at the Blue Moon, but now her songs carried messages meant for an audience of one. Friedrich attended her performances whenever his duties allowed, reading in her choice of melodies and lyrics the private communications that they dared not speak aloud in public. They developed an elaborate system of signals and coded conversations that allowed them to maintain contact even when surrounded by those who would destroy them if they suspected the truth. A particular song meant that Alina needed to see Friedrich urgently. A specific gesture during applause indicated that Friedrich had news to share. Their love became a language spoken in glances and subtle touches, a secret code that only they could decipher. The risk of discovery grew with each passing day as their feelings deepened beyond anything either had thought possible. Alina found herself taking chances that would have terrified her weeks earlier, lingering after performances to steal a few precious minutes of conversation with Friedrich. He began volunteering for duties that would keep him in Budapest rather than accepting transfers that would have advanced his career, but separated him from the woman who had become the center of his universe. Other people were beginning to notice the connection between them, though none yet understood its true nature. The Blue Moon's manager commented on Alina's improved performances, attributing her increased passion to artistic maturity rather than romantic inspiration. Friedrich's fellow officers teased him about his frequent visits to the nightclub, assuming his interest was purely physical rather than recognizing the profound emotional bond that was developing. But Budapest in late 1944 was a city where secrets rarely remained hidden for long, where survival often depended on reporting suspicious behavior to the appropriate authorities. Alina and Friedrich were walking a tightrope stretched across an abyss, their love balanced precariously between discovery and destruction. The question was not whether their secret would eventually be exposed, but whether they would have the courage to face the consequences when that inevitable moment arrived. The winter of 1944 was approaching, bringing with it the promise of a siege that would test every relationship, every loyalty, every bond that connected the people of Budapest to each other and to their own humanity. Alina and Friedrich had found love in the shadow of war, but now they would discover whether that love was strong enough to survive the ultimate test that history was preparing to inflict upon them both. The first test of their deepening bond came sooner than either had anticipated. Budapest's German command had received intelligence reports suggesting that resistance activities were increasing throughout the city, with particular concern about potential sympathizers among the officer corps. A new security protocol was implemented, requiring detailed reports on the activities and associations of all military personnel stationed in the Hungarian capital. Friedrich found himself under subtle but unmistakable surveillance. His movements were being tracked, his conversations monitored, his choice of entertainment venues noted and analyzed by men whose job it was to detect the first signs of disloyalty or compromise. The casual freedom he had enjoyed in pursuing his relationship with Alina suddenly became a luxury he could no longer afford. Alina faced her own form of scrutiny as the Arrow Cross militia intensified their efforts to root out what they called cultural degeneracy among Budapest's entertainment establishments. The Blue Moon's clientele was being examined more carefully, with particular attention paid to any Hungarian performers who seemed too comfortable in the company of German officers. The delicate balance Alina had maintained between survival and dignity was becoming increasingly precarious. Their midnight walks through the city streets became impossible as military patrols increased their frequency and began demanding identification from anyone found on the streets after curfew. The bombing raids that had once provided cover for their private meetings now served as reminders of how quickly their world could be reduced to rubble and ash. Yet rather than driving them apart, these mounting pressures only intensified their need for each other. Alina began leaving messages for Friedrich hidden in books at a small cafe near the Blue Moon, coded communications that spoke of her love in language that would appear innocent to casual observers. Friedrich responded by attending her performances with a devotion that bordered on recklessness, his eyes never leaving her face as she sang songs that seemed chosen specifically to speak to his heart. The other performers at the Blue Moon began to whisper among themselves about Alina's obvious favoritism toward the German officer who occupied the same corner table night after night. Some viewed her behavior with envy, assuming she was securing special protection through her association with the enemy. Others watched with growing suspicion, wondering whether Alina's loyalty to Hungary had been completely compromised by whatever relationship she was developing with the Wehrmacht captain. These whispers reached the ears of Károly Nagy, a Hungarian collaborator who had appointed himself as an unofficial watchdog over the city's entertainment industry. Nagy had grown wealthy by informing on fellow Hungarians who showed insufficient enthusiasm for the German alliance, and he viewed Alina's behavior as potentially profitable intelligence that could be sold to the appropriate authorities. The confrontation between Nagy and Alina took place in her dressing room after a particularly emotional performance that had left the Blue Moon's audience visibly moved by her artistry. Nagy entered without knocking, his presence immediately filling the small space with an atmosphere of menace that made Alina's skin crawl with instinctive fear. He spoke in the oily tones of a man who enjoyed having power over others, suggesting that Alina's career might benefit from demonstrating more explicit appreciation for Hungary's German allies. The implications of his words were clear enough, though he was careful to avoid making any direct threats that could be reported to authorities who might not approve of his freelance intelligence gathering. Alina responded with the same dignified composure that had carried her through 3 years of occupation, neither confirming nor denying Nagy's suspicions, while making it clear that she understood exactly what kind of man she was dealing with. Her refusal to be intimidated only increased Nagi's determination to find evidence that could be used against her. Friedrich, meanwhile, was discovering that his own position had become far more precarious than he had initially realized. His commanding officer, Oberst Heinrich Richter, summoned him to a private meeting that began with routine military business but quickly shifted to more personal concerns. Richter was a career officer who had survived the war thus far by maintaining absolute loyalty to his superiors, while cultivating relationships that might prove useful if Germany's fortunes continued to decline. He had noticed Friedrich's frequent visits to the Blue Moon and was curious about whether these social activities might represent opportunities for gathering intelligence about Hungarian civilian morale. The conversation that followed was a masterpiece of military diplomacy, with both men speaking in careful euphemisms while understanding perfectly what was really being discussed. Richter wanted to know whether Friedrich's interest in the Hungarian singer was purely personal or whether it might serve broader strategic purposes. Friedrich found himself walking a verbal tightrope, acknowledging his appreciation for Alina's performances while avoiding any admission that might compromise either of their safety. What emerged from this meeting was an arrangement that satisfied Richter's need for intelligence, while providing Friedrich with official justification for continuing his relationship with Alina. He would be tasked with cultivating Hungarian cultural figures who might provide insights into civilian attitudes toward the German occupation, with Alina serving as his primary contact within Budapest's entertainment community. This official sanction solved some of Friedrich's immediate problems while creating new dangers that neither he nor Alina had anticipated. Their relationship now carried the weight of military expectations, transforming their private romance into a matter of state security that could be scrutinized by authorities at the highest levels of German command. Alina learned of this development during one of their carefully orchestrated meetings, and her reaction revealed the depth of understanding she had developed about the treacherous world they were navigating. Rather than being offended by Friedrich's use of their relationship for official purposes, she immediately grasped the protection that such an arrangement might provide for both of them. Together, they began crafting a performance within their performance, creating the illusion of a professional relationship that served German intelligence interests while concealing the profound personal bond that had developed between them. Alina would provide Friedrich with carefully selected information about Hungarian civilian attitudes, intelligence that was accurate enough to satisfy his superiors while revealing nothing that could genuinely harm her countrymen. Friedrich would file reports praising Alina's cooperation and emphasizing her value as a source of cultural intelligence, creating an official record that justified their continued association while documenting her apparent loyalty to German interests. The deception required extraordinary skill from both of them, demanding that they maintain their authentic emotional connection while playing roles that satisfied the expectations of those who watched their every move. The complexity of their situation was further complicated by the rapidly changing military situation surrounding Budapest. Soviet forces had advanced to within artillery range of the city's outer defenses, and German commanders were beginning to prepare for a siege that could last for months. The Blue Moon's clientele increasingly consisted of officers who were either celebrating what might be their final weeks of comfort or drowning their fears in expensive alcohol and temporary pleasures. Alina's performances took on new urgency as her audience faced the possibility of death or captivity in the near future. She sang with a passion that moved hardened soldiers to tears, her voice carrying emotions that transcended language and nationality. These performances created an atmosphere of shared vulnerability that temporarily dissolved the barriers between occupier and occupied, revealing the common humanity that war was supposed to destroy. Friedrich watched these transformations with growing amazement at Alina's ability to touch something essential in every person who heard her sing. Her music had become a form of ministry, offering comfort and hope to men who had forgotten that such things were possible. He began to understand that loving Alina meant not just protecting her personally, but preserving the gift she brought to a world that desperately needed beauty and compassion. The relationship between them deepened during this period in ways that went beyond romantic attraction or physical desire. They had become partners in a mission that neither fully articulated but both understood completely. Together, they were creating pockets of humanity within an inhuman system, using their positions and their love to preserve something precious that would otherwise be lost to the machinery of destruction. But even as their bond grew stronger, the external pressures that threatened to destroy them continued to intensify. Nagi's surveillance of Alina became more systematic and intrusive, while new security protocols required Friedrich to account for every hour of his off-duty time. The margin for error in their carefully constructed deception was shrinking daily, bringing them closer to a moment of truth that would determine whether their love could survive the ultimate test that history was preparing to impose upon them. The citizens of Budapest were beginning to prepare for a siege that military experts predicted could rival Stalingrad in its duration and brutality. Food was being rationed more strictly, civilian movement was being restricted, and the city's ancient walls were being reinforced with modern defensive positions, designed to turn every street into a potential battlefield. Alina and Friedrich understood that they were approaching a crossroads that would force them to choose between their love and their survival. The safe middle ground they had occupied for weeks was disappearing, replaced by circumstances that would demand absolute commitment to choices that could not be undone. Their impossible romance had flourished in the shadows between conflicting loyalties, but those shadows were rapidly disappearing as the harsh light of total war prepared to illuminate every corner of their carefully constructed world. The question that haunted both of them was whether love could survive when survival itself demanded betraying everything they had come to mean to each other. They had found each other across the artificial boundaries that war creates, but now those same boundaries were hardening into walls that might prove impossible to cross. The test that awaited them would determine not just their personal fate, but whether human connection could triumph over the forces that seemed determined to reduce their world to nothing but ash and memory. The siege of Budapest began on December 26, 1944, transforming the city into a hellscape that would test every bond of love and loyalty that its citizens had forged during the occupation years. Soviet artillery shells screamed overhead with mechanical precision, reducing centuries-old buildings to rubble, while German defenders fought desperately to maintain positions that everyone knew were ultimately doomed. Alina found herself trapped in a city that was eating itself alive. The blue moon had closed permanently when the first shells began falling, its crystal chandeliers now buried beneath tons of collapsed masonry. The wealthy patrons who had once filled its tables were either dead, fled, or huddled in basement shelters, waiting for liberation or annihilation with equal uncertainty. Friedrich's duties had transformed overnight from administrative oversight to direct combat command. He was responsible for a section of the city's defensive perimeter that included the district where Alina lived, a coincidence that felt like divine intervention disguised as military necessity. His official reports described tactical positions and supply requirements, but his real attention was focused on protecting the woman who had become more important to him than his own survival. The apartment building where Alina had lived for 2 years became one of hundreds of improvised fortresses scattered throughout the city. Windows were bricked up to create firing positions, while basement storage rooms were converted into shelters that housed families who had never spoken to each other before the bombing began. The social distinctions that had defined Budapest's civilian hierarchy dissolved under the equalizing pressure of shared terror. Alina discovered that her voice, which had once entertained German officers in luxurious nightclubs, now served a different purpose entirely. She sang to children who cried in the darkness of overcrowded shelters, her lullabies providing comfort that no amount of food or warmth could match. She organized the other women in maintaining sanitation and morale, using skills she had learned performing for hostile audiences to keep hope alive among people who had every reason to despair. The transformation was remarkable to witness. The woman who had spent 3 years walking the delicate line between collaboration and resistance had found her true calling in circumstances that stripped away every pretense and revealed the essential character beneath. Alina became a leader not through appointment or election, but through the natural authority that comes from caring more about others than about oneself. Friedrich visited the shelter whenever his military duties allowed, ostensibly to check on civilian morale and ensure that defensive positions were not being compromised by overcrowding. But the residents quickly understood that his real purpose was to see Alina, and their reaction surprised him with its warmth rather than hostility. These people had every reason to hate German officers, yet they welcomed Friedrich with genuine gratitude for his obvious devotion to Alina's welfare. They had watched her transform their makeshift community into something approaching a family, and they recognized that the man who loved her was somehow part of that transformation. The children in the shelter began calling Friedrich Uncle Fritz, a nickname that would have been unthinkable months earlier when he represented the enemy occupation force. Now, he brought them small gifts when supplies allowed, told them stories about his childhood in Bavaria, and helped Alina organize activities that made their underground existence bearable. But the siege was taking a terrible toll on both Alina and Friedrich in ways that went beyond physical hardship. Alina was losing weight rapidly as she insisted on sharing her food rations with the children, her face growing gaunt despite Friedrich's efforts to bring additional supplies from military stores. The constant stress of maintaining morale for dozens of frightened people was exhausting her reserves of strength in ways that months of performing for hostile audiences had never managed. Friedrich was aging visibly under the pressure of defending positions that became more hopeless with each passing day. Soviet forces had completed their encirclement of the city, cutting off all hope of reinforcement or resupply. German commanders were beginning to discuss surrender terms, though such conversations were conducted in whispers that could result in charges of treason if overheard by the wrong people. The man who had once questioned his orders from a position of relative comfort now found himself making life and death decisions that affected hundreds of civilians. Every choice about where to position his limited forces, every decision about how to allocate scarce medical supplies, carried consequences that would haunt him regardless of whether he survived the siege. Alina and Friedrich's relationship deepened during this period in ways that peacetime romance could never have achieved. They were no longer simply two people who had found love despite impossible circumstances. They had become partners in a desperate struggle to preserve human dignity in conditions designed to destroy it. Their conversations in the shelter's dim corridors revealed depths of character that neither had fully recognized in themselves or each other. Alina spoke of her growing understanding that survival meant more than simply staying alive, that preserving humanity required active choices to care for others even when caring seemed pointless. Friedrich described his evolution from reluctant soldier to genuine protector, his realization that wearing a uniform meant nothing if he failed to use his authority to shield the innocent. The other shelter residents became witnesses to a love story that transcended the categories that war had imposed upon human relationships. They watched Alina and Friedrich support each other through moments of despair that would have broken weaker bonds, saw them make sacrifices for each other's welfare that went far beyond romantic gesture into something approaching spiritual commitment. An elderly Hungarian professor named Dr. Kovacs, who had lost his university position early in the occupation, began documenting their story in a journal he kept hidden beneath his mattress. He wrote about watching Alina and Friedrich discover that love in wartime required not just emotional connection, but practical partnership in the work of keeping hope alive among the hopeless. The professor's observations captured details that Alina and Friedrich themselves were too exhausted and overwhelmed to notice. He recorded how they had developed an almost telepathic understanding of each other's needs, how Alina would begin singing before Friedrich arrived at the shelter, somehow sensing when he was approaching despite the chaos outside. He noted how Friedrich would bring medical supplies that Alina needed before she asked for them, as if he could read in her face the health concerns she was trying to hide from the other residents. But Dr. Kovacs also documented the mounting strain that was threatening to destroy what they had built together. The siege had entered its second month with no sign of ending, and both Alina and Friedrich were showing signs of the psychological trauma that prolonged exposure to violence inflicts on even the strongest personalities. Alina had begun having nightmares that left her screaming in languages she didn't remember learning, her subconscious mind processing horrors that her waking thoughts refused to acknowledge. Friedrich suffered from insomnia that kept him pacing the shelter's corridors during the few hours when he should have been resting, his mind unable to quiet the constant calculations of threat and response that military command demanded. Their love, which had once provided sanctuary from the madness surrounding them, was beginning to feel like another burden that neither could afford to carry. The energy required to maintain their emotional connection was energy that needed to be directed towards simple survival as food grew scarcer and the bombing intensified. The crisis point came during the third week of February, when Soviet forces launched a major assault on Friedrich's sector of the defensive perimeter. The attack began before dawn with an artillery barrage that shook the shelter's foundation and sent chunks of plaster raining down on the huddled residents. Alina knew immediately that Friedrich was in mortal danger, though military protocol prevented her from receiving any official information about the battle raging above their heads. She could only listen to the sounds of combat and pray to saints she had abandoned years ago, begging for protection for the man who had become her anchor in a world gone completely mad. The battle lasted for 18 hours, during which Alina maintained a vigil that impressed even Dr. Kovacs with its intensity. She refused food, refused rest, refused comfort from the other residents who tried to distract her from her fears. Instead, she sang continuously, her voice providing a soundtrack of hope that kept the entire shelter's morale from collapsing completely. When Friedrich finally appeared in the shelter's entrance, bloodied and exhausted but alive, the reunion that followed was witnessed by dozens of people who understood they were seeing something extraordinary. Alina ran to him with no thought for dignity or appearances, and he caught her in an embrace that spoke of gratitude for survival and relief at reunion. But the cost of that day's fighting had been enormous. Friedrich's unit had lost more than half its men, and the defensive positions they had died to protect were ultimately abandoned when ammunition ran out. The German perimeter was contracting daily, squeezing the remaining defenders and civilian population into an ever smaller area that would soon become impossible to defend. Friedrich brought news that civilian evacuation was being planned for those areas closest to Soviet lines, but the process would be dangerous and offered no guarantee of safety for those who attempted it. Alina faced a choice that crystallized everything their relationship had come to represent. She could accept evacuation and probable survival, abandoning Friedrich to face the siege's final phase alone. Or she could remain in the shelter, sharing whatever fate awaited the man she loved while risking death for both of them. The decision she made would define not just her own character, but the true nature of the love that had bloomed between them in the most impossible circumstances imaginable. Dr. Kovacs prepared to record in his hidden journal whatever choice Alina made, understanding that he was witnessing a moment that would reveal whether human love could triumph over the most extreme pressures that history could devise. The shelter's residents waited in silence as Alina considered options that would determine whether their community would survive intact or be scattered to whatever mercy the war's final phase might offer. The woman who had once sung for German officers in luxurious nightclubs now held the power to choose between survival and loyalty, between safety and love, between the practical wisdom of escape and the terrible beauty of standing firm in the face of certain destruction. Alina's answer would echo through the remaining days of the siege, becoming part of a love story that transcended the boundaries of nationality and ideology, to reveal something essential about human nature that no amount of violence could completely destroy. The choice she made in that crowded basement, surrounded by witnesses who had become family, would determine whether her romance with Friedrich ended in tragedy or transformation. The professor sharpened his pencil and prepared to record history being made in the most unlikely of circumstances, by two people whose love had already survived tests that would have defeated any bond based on mere attraction or convenience. What happened next would determine whether their impossible romance could endure the ultimate trial that war was preparing to impose upon every soul trapped in the dying city of Budapest. Alina looked into Friedrich's eyes, seeing in them the same exhaustion and desperate hope that she felt in her own heart. The sounds of battle had grown quieter in recent hours, but everyone in the shelter understood that this was not victory, merely a temporary lull before the final assault that would decide their fate. Doctor. Kovacs watched from his corner as Alina took Friedrich's bloodied hands in her own, her decision crystallizing with a clarity that seemed to illuminate the dim basement like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. When she spoke, her voice carried the same quiet authority that had sustained the shelter's residents through weeks of terror and uncertainty. She would not leave. She would not accept evacuation while Friedrich remained to face whatever came next. Their love had been forged in circumstances that tested every human bond, and she refused to abandon it now, when that test was reaching its ultimate conclusion. The other residents received her announcement with a mixture of admiration and sorrow, understanding that Alina was choosing loyalty over survival in a way that few would have the courage to emulate. The children who had come to depend on her songs began to weep, not from fear of the bombs falling outside, but from the realization that their makeshift family was about to be tested in ways that might scatter them forever. Friedrich's reaction surprised everyone, including Alina herself. Rather than gratitude or relief, his face showed something approaching anguish as he grasped the full implications of her decision. He had hoped she would choose safety, would preserve herself even if it meant their separation. Her determination to share his fate filled him with joy and terror in equal measure. The conversation that followed between them took place in whispers that nonetheless carried to every corner of the crowded shelter. Friedrich spoke of his growing certainty that the siege would end in German surrender within days, that Soviet forces would soon be pouring through the city's broken defenses. Alina's presence during those final hours would not change the military outcome, but it would ensure that both of them faced whatever came next together. Alina's response revealed depths of understanding about their situation that went beyond romantic sentiment into something approaching spiritual commitment. She had watched Friedrich transform from reluctant occupier into genuine protector, had seen him use his position to shield the innocent rather than exploit the vulnerable. If he was prepared to face the consequences of wearing a German uniform when Budapest fell, then she was prepared to face the consequences of loving him. Dr. Kovacs began writing furiously in his hidden journal, recognizing that he was witnessing something extraordinary unfolding in the most ordinary of circumstances. Two people who had found each other across the artificial divisions that war created were now choosing to remain united despite every practical argument for separation. Their love had become an act of defiance against forces that sought to reduce human relationships to nothing more than strategic calculations. The next morning brought news that confirmed Friedrich's assessment of their military situation. Soviet forces had broken through the eastern defensive line, and German commanders were beginning to discuss terms for surrender. The fighting would continue for several more days, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Alina spent those final hours of the siege doing what she had always done best, using her voice to provide comfort and hope to people who desperately needed both. But now, her songs carried new meaning, becoming farewell performances for an audience that had become family during their weeks together in the underground shelter. She sang Hungarian folk songs that spoke of love surviving separation, of hope enduring through the darkest nights, of spring returning after even the harshest winters. Her voice had never been more beautiful or more heartbreaking, carrying emotions that words alone could never express. Friedrich listened to these performances with the intensity of someone memorizing every note, every inflection, every breath. He understood that these might be the last times he would hear Alina sing, that whatever came after Budapest's surrender would test their relationship in ways that military combat never could. The other residents joined their voices to Alina's during those final concerts, creating harmonies that rose through the building's damaged structure and echoed across streets filled with rubble and the remnants of a once great city. Their music became a form of prayer, a declaration that beauty could still exist even as their world collapsed around them. When the German surrender finally came on February 13, 1945, it arrived not with dramatic ceremony, but with exhausted relief from soldiers who had fought beyond the limits of human endurance. Friedrich removed his officer's insignia and prepared to face whatever judgment awaited him as a prisoner of war, while Alina prepared to face questions about her relationship with the enemy that had sustained her through the occupation's darkest months. The Soviet soldiers who entered their shelter were younger than Alina had expected, many barely out of their teens, their faces showing the same exhaustion that marked everyone who had survived the siege. They treated the civilians with surprising gentleness, offering medical attention and food rations, while processing the German prisoners, who would face an uncertain future in Soviet custody. Alina watched as Friedrich was led away with the other captured officers, their eyes meeting one final time across the crowded basement that had sheltered their impossible romance. No words passed between them, but both understood that they were facing a separation that might prove permanent, that the love which had flourished in wartime might not survive the complexities of whatever peace would follow. Dr. Kovacs carefully hid his journal beneath loose floorboards before the Soviet authorities began their interrogations, preserving for posterity the record of a love story that had transcended every boundary that war had tried to impose. His documentation would eventually find its way to archives where historians would marvel at the human capacity for connection, even under the most extreme circumstances. Alina's interrogation lasted for 3 days, during which she was questioned extensively about her relationship with German officers and her activities during the occupation. She answered honestly about her work as an entertainer, about the necessity that had forced her to perform for audiences she despised, about the gradual evolution of her feelings for one particular officer who had shown her kindness when kindness was the most dangerous gift anyone could offer. Alina and Friedrich's story reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, love finds a way to transcend the boundaries that hatred tries to build between us. Their romance survived the siege of Budapest, but like so many wartime love stories, it was scattered by the winds of history that followed. Friedrich spent 7 years in Soviet labor camps before returning to a Germany that no longer existed as he had known it. Alina rebuilt her life in a Hungary transformed by new occupiers, her voice carrying the memory of impossible love through decades of silence about the past. They never saw each other again, but their story lives on as proof that the human heart recognizes no uniforms, no flags, no artificial divisions when it encounters another soul in need of compassion. Sometimes the greatest victories happen not on battlefields, but in basement shelters where two people choose love over survival, hope over despair, connection over the safety of remaining strangers.